Imagine screams almost every day, suspicious people walking back and forth, piles of junk, broken bottles, and used syringes. This isn't a news report about a distant drug den, it's the reality in a residential district of Lviv. Actually, a building in one of these districts. That building where two elderly men were brutally tortured and eventually killed. And you know what is especially frightening, maybe even the most frightening? That one of the attackers was a 16-year-old schoolboy, and among the stated reasons for the attack was 200 hryvnias, just like that. Well, if you can, make yourselves comfortable, dear ones, because this is truly frightening. There is an abandoned building on Bohdan Khmelnytsky Street in Lviv. There used to be a youth social rehabilitation center there, but then it closed down. It took a long time to find a new owner for the building. Rumors say a full church was planned there, but the city council instead wanted a multi-story building with a chapel. The locals didn't like the last idea, and people protested against it. In the end, neither what was rumored nor what was in the urban planning documents appeared there. The abandoned building was quickly turned into an ordinary dump in the middle of the courtyards. And then people started moving in, homeless people who had nowhere else to go. Strange sounds constantly came from there, screams and moans. The people who lived in the nearby houses didn't like it, but no one took any action. Well, let it be. So, one of the homeless people who moved into the building in 2020 was a 70-year-old man. His name is not disclosed in court documents, and the media referred to him in different ways. So, for easier understanding, I will call him Mr. Yevhen here and further on. So, at least since the fall of 2020, Mr. Yevhen started spending his days and nights in the abandoned building on Bohdan Khmelnytsky Street. That's building number 249 just in case. Mr. Yevhen hadn't been in touch with his family, including his son, for a long time. He basically didn't live with his relatives at all. The son said that his father decided to leave home on his own because he was, let's say, abusing alcohol quite a lot. Not the happiest story, unfortunately, but also, you have to agree, not something exceptional. Actually, it was in search of shelter that Yevhen came to the abandoned building. And to be honest, he not only slept there, but also drank, sometimes quite heavily and sometimes not alone. From time to time, other homeless people and just those who liked to drink would keep Mr. Yevhen company. One of them was a 64-year-old man, let's call him Semen. Semen lived with his wife near an abandoned building, but according to his relatives, he had recently started living a vagrant lifestyle and often hung out at the former social center. The men collected glass bottles and waste paper, turned them in at recycling centers, and then spent the money on living and on drinking. One of the mentioned men's pensions was also spent on drinking. I can't judge or say how this group felt on a daily basis. But one thing I know for sure, in September 2020, everything changed drastically. And it's not that even one of the men decided to radically change his life and work through the problems that were weighing him down. Talk to friends, family, or specialists. And thank you. Let's get back to the story. On the 10th, the men had uninvited guests. Two young men. One is 16, the other is 18 years old. They snuck inside through openings where doors or windows used to be. And they disappeared from the sight of those outside. Inside, they looked around. It was their first time in this new place. What they intended to do from the start is unknown, but when the guys realized they weren't alone, the focus of their attention became completely clear. Again, there is no information in the court records about what conversations took place between the young men and the homeless people they caught in the abandoned building on September 10th. However, there is plenty of information about what happened the next day when the guys came back. Officially, and in bureaucratic language, let's put it that way, it sounds like this. Actions that cause particular psychological and moral suffering. Actions that torture, disgrace honor, and humiliate dignity. How this looks in detail and in practice is difficult for a mentally healthy person to comprehend. On September 11, the young men sneaked into the abandoned building around 2 p.m. They already had a plan. They picked up wooden chair legs and decided that these would be their instruments of torture. Blow after blow, the young man beat Mr. Yevhen, hitting his torso, then his limbs, and then moved onto his head. The elderly homeless man begged them to stop, but the boys ignored his pleas. They decided that what they had done wasn't enough. They pulled blue children's tights over Mr. Yevhen's head. Was it hard to breathe in that? Of course it was. However, when your plan is to inflict moral and physical suffering, you probably have no desire to stop. As one attacker pulled pantyhose over the homeless man's head, the other kept beating the half-conscious old man with a wooden leg, targeting his torso and limbs. For head blows, one young man picked a different weapon, an old woman's handbag he found nearby. He used it, but it didn't really satisfy his desire to see someone suffer. So the guy decided to use his own feet to beat. At first, he focused on the head and torso and then grabbed a belt and started whipping the 70-year-old grandfather in the face with it. Another abuser also joined in the torture, beating the old man with a wooden leg and his own feet. This horror didn't last just minutes, it continued for an hour. And all this horror was filmed by the uninvited guests. And Mr. Yevhen wasn't the only one who suffered that day. He was in the room with an old acquaintance, Semen. That old man also didn't escape from the attackers. He was struck on his limbs and torso with the same wooden chair leg. And then one of the guys picked up a metal pipe. Again, his arms, legs, and torso were injured. But it didn't stop there. Unfortunately, under the threat of new physical violence, Mr. Semen was forced to take off his outer clothing and pour used motor oil over himself. He did as they said, but even that wasn't enough for the attackers. They continued to threaten the old man and eventually ordered him, let's say, to perform sexual acts with another homeless person. Mr. Semen flatly refused to do it. Fortunately, the criminals did not insist on carrying out their plan. Was physical abuse the goal of the young men? Well, I'll say this. Besides beating and threats, they were also engaged in extortion, 200 hryvnias. That's the amount one attacker demanded from his victims after the torture ended. Not getting what he wanted, he took a chain from Mr. Semen. Just some kind of metal chain, the value of which he wasn't even sure about, because he didn't know what it was made of. And then he started threatening again to hurt the old man if he didn't give him his bank card. Mr. Semen received his pension that same day. At 1327, 2,385 hryvnias and 20 kopecks appeared in the bank account. The criminals took his card and the abuse lasted about an hour, from 2 to 3 o'clock. For many of us, this time passes quickly, but for Yevhen and Semen, it probably felt like an eternity. After tormenting the friends, the attackers left the scene of the crime. Now they had a new plan, to spend what they had stolen. At first, the guys tried to withdraw cash from an automated teller machine, but the attempt failed. So the young men went shopping, let's say, to pay for something directly with the card without withdrawing cash. They visited grocery stores, cafes, and a gas station. They spent a little over 2,000 on September 11 and 12. Although, to be exact, they spent 2,029 hryvnias and 45 kopecks. The criminals also stole a passport, an identification code, and a pension certificate from one of the victims. Why? The plan was as reliable as a Swiss watch. They planned to take out a loan. For obvious reasons, that didn't work out. But what about their victims in the meantime? It won't surprise anyone that the grandfathers felt very bad. Mr. Semen later found the strength to get up and go home. He said that he needed to get himself together because the next day he had to go to work. But Mr. Yevhen hardly moved at all. He was just breathing very, very heavily. That evening, an acquaintance visited the men. He sometimes visited the abandoned building, bringing food and drink. Actually, more than just that. It is known for sure that it was Belyashi and beer. Also, this acquaintance sometimes stayed there overnight. But on September 11, even if he wanted to, he changed his mind. The scene the man saw was very frightening. His friends lay on the floor, barely alive, covered in bruises, scrapes, and blood. And they were also dirty because they were covered in machine oil. When their friend asked what had happened, Yevhen and Semen advised him not to pay attention. They said 2 unknown men beat them, demanded money, took their pension passport and bank card, but the owner had forgotten the card's password. By the next day, the abandoned building was silent, except for old Mr. Semen groaning in pain. But on September 12, everything once again became like a horror movie. The young men arrived around 4 o'clock that Saturday afternoon. Again, sneaking inside, they saw Mr. Yevhen, who was helplessly lying on the ground. And again they started beating him. However, this time they used only their feet. They kicked the old man for half an hour on his head, arms, legs, and torso, leaving no part uninjured. They recorded everything on their phones and even poured construction mix on him during it. It's a white, sometimes gray powder. The criminals abused Mr. Semen in a similar way. This time there was simply nothing valuable to take, so after half an hour of torture, the guys left the building. Later that same Saturday, Semen's acquaintances, Yevhen, visited there. The men wanted to check how they were feeling after the previous beatings. However, the scene before them was even more depressing than Friday's. One old man could barely move and was spitting blood, while the other, Yevhen, was just lying there with no signs of life. Realizing there was no more time to waste, the men called an ambulance. However, it was already too late for Yevhen. Even if the medics had teleported and started giving him emergency aid that very second, it wouldn't have saved him because he was already dead. This wasn't a random head injury that caused his death. There was a series of injuries there that could eventually have led to the worst possible outcome. Here's just a small part of what the medical staff recorded in their documentation. Closed head injuries, specifically hemorrhages under the brain membrane and soft tissues of the head, hemorrhages under the soft membrane of the cerebellum, fractures of 6 ribs, a split lip, bruises, contusions, abrasions, scratches on the forehead, behind the ears, on the thighs, shins, knees, shoulders, and lower back. Actually, it wasn't a body, but a blue, bloody mass. The young men treated a living person like a punching bag, just a piece of meat to beat. On September 12, Lviv doctors could only fight for Semen's life. He was taken from the tragic scene to the intensive care unit, where he was eventually put on a ventilator. Here is how his condition was commented on by Natalia Matolinets, the head of the anesthesiology and intensive care unit at the clinical emergency hospital.
The man had a severe traumatic brain injury, a severe brain contusion, a spark-detectable brain injury, torso trauma, multiple contusions all over his body, and a broken arm. He was in a deep coma and on artificial lung ventilation.
In this condition, old Semen lived for almost 10 more days, but on September 18, his heart stopped. Fortunately, this was not a case where no one cared about the homeless, because when the workers quickly recorded what happened, law enforcement officers arrived at the scene. Within a few hours, the offenders were already suspects and were being interrogated in the investigator's office. The Lviv region police chief quickly reported the high-profile incident and shared a photo from the meeting with the young men on social media.
Thanks to the professional and well-coordinated work of all police units, as well as clear coordination of actions, within a few hours, detectives from the Shevchenkivsky Police Department identified and detained a 16-year-old resident of Lviv and an 18-year-old resident of Zovkivshchina, those involved in committing this crime.
However, I should note that the excitement over the actions of law enforcement should still be tempered. The thing is, the short-sighted but cruel young men themselves returned to the scene of the crime to once again demand money from their victims. The older perpetrator had a phone with him that contained all the recordings of the abuse of the homeless. What can be said about these young men? There was and still is little information, considering the age of at least one of them at the time the crime was committed. Briefly, as a reference, they can be described as follows. The beating and murder were committed by then 16-year-old Dmitro and 18-year-old Yuri. The younger was a schoolboy, the older a vocational school student. The boys had known each other for more than a year, as well as the court. Both of them had previously been caught stealing. Both had mediocre records at the places where they studied, if not to say extremely negative. A vocational school number 48 employee, where the older cat studied, called him inadequate.
The child is inadequate. When he came, he caused trouble and didn't attend classes. He even brought a stun gun to school, which delivers an electric shock. Well, he didn't scare the kids. He approached them, his classmates, and other children ahead.
It was Yuri whom the police identified as the instigator of the violence. But still, not everyone fell under the influence of the older friend. As it turned out later, the young men brought another one of their friends to the abandoned building. They often spent time together, so they thought that this kind of fun would appeal to the guy. He was invited to the abandoned building and offered to join in abusing the old homeless people. However, the young man refused, although he watched from the sidelines. In particular, he confirmed that his friends struck the elderly men 5 to 10 times each with a metal rod and a wooden chair leg. What was he doing at that time? He stood nearby and watched. Later, in statements to law enforcement in court, the young man explained his actions by saying he was afraid. He said he was just afraid to tell anyone what he had seen himself. He was too afraid to stop his angry friends. Without this fear, 2 lives might have been saved. On the other hand, maybe there wouldn't have been another one lost. Ultimately, this silent witness learned about the homeless people's deaths solely from television news. Due to the event's unusual nature, impact, and extreme cruelty, it's unsurprising the court ordered a psychiatric evaluation for the attackers. The specialists had to determine whether the young men were aware of what they were doing, whether they had any mental issues, and so on. It turned out that, in a certain sense, they did. However, this did not mean Lviv was dealing with people who had severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia or those who hear commanding voices. The younger attacker had no diagnoses, but the older one did. In childhood, he was repeatedly treated in a psychiatric hospital with a diagnosis of organic mental disorder with cognitive and pronounced behavioral disorders, personality psychopathization, and social maladaptation. However, the forensic psychiatric examination concluded that at the moment when he was beating innocent people and torturing them, he did not have a mental illness. It also did not manifest itself during the investigation or at the court hearings. According to the experts, the sadist's condition should only be regarded as a dissocial personality disorder. In simple terms and generally speaking, this meant that the 18-year-old criminal understood the meaning of his actions, and he was fully capable of controlling them. Therefore, he had to stand trial. Both of them had the sense to admit their guilt, although, who knows, maybe it was all the advice from the lawyers they had, and also the video evidence on the phone, which was very hard to dispute. Both of them later explained in court that they recorded the torture on video to brag to their friends. What better reason to be proud? They should have shown it to their relatives at the table too. Here, look, it's almost like a diploma with honors. Nevertheless, one of the key questions is what motivated their actions. Because if both of them are mentally healthy, well, almost, why did they behave like sadists? One victim's wife said the reason was 200 hryvnias. Her partner and his friend once borrowed this money from the young men who have now returned to collect it.
They admitted that they demanded 200 hryvnias each from the man and his friend.
Although it was clear they wouldn't get money from those 2 old men. And actually, that was just an excuse, not the real reason. The young thugs just wanted to show off.
Although the court documents don't mention anything about the debt, the young men explained the reason for their brutal actions differently. At the time of the attacks, they were drunk. There was no real motive. They drank, tried to show off to friends, and killed 2 people. That's the so-called logical chain of events, in big quotation marks. When it all just happened, the media wrote that the criminals could even face life imprisonment. But in the end, they were charged with assault with the intent to seize someone else's property, causing serious bodily harm, and also taking someone else's important personal documents. That turned out to be not enough for a life sentence, and in the end, the attackers didn't even get the maximum terms. On March 29, 2021, the judge of the Shevchenkivsky court of Lviv handed down the following sentences to the young men. The 18-year-old thief received 12 years and 2 months of imprisonment, while the younger one, who was already 17 at the time, got 8 years and 2 months in prison. Of course, this won't bring back the lives of the 2 elderly people. After the tragedy in Lviv, at 11 Akademika Yefremova Street, a mural called Invisible People was painted on the building. The mural depicts a homeless woman and man, surrounded by a dotted line, and inside each person, there is a sky. The authors, representatives of the youth movement Youth for Peace, explained their idea this way.
Often, a poor person is as if cut out from the city landscape, deprived of rights, dignity, and individuality. The mural shows opposition to this violence, which shouldn't become normal.
And in a certain sense, they are right. In Ukraine, homeless people often suffer from acts of violence. Reports of homeless people being beaten in a Ukrainian city surface repeatedly, sometimes even daily. Sometimes it ends with only minor bodily injuries, sometimes with death. For example, in 2013, a 50-year-old man in Lviv asked 2 young men for money for alcohol. He was badly beaten and the homeless man died. A similar incident occurred in Kyiv in 2016. The men beat 3 homeless people with sticks and kicked them, killing 1. In 2018, 2 students in Dnipropetrovsk region beat a homeless man to death for fun. In 2023, Kiev residents called themselves law enforcement officers and abused homeless people, recording it on their phones. In 2021, in the same capital, 2 men were detained after beating a homeless man, and once he couldn't defend himself, pouring a flammable substance on him and setting him on fire. The man died from his injuries. In the same year, 2 homeless people's bodies were found in Dnipro. According to the police, a group of 3 people was celebrating a birthday. They were drinking outside by the heating main when they saw some homeless people warming themselves nearby. Then, one of the group members rushed at them and started stabbing the homeless people, and afterwards grabbed a piece of concrete slab and threw it at their heads. The self-defense argument doesn't apply here. Law enforcement made a brief statement at the time.
The group of detainees was consuming alcoholic beverages. They had a conflict with 2 homeless people. During this conflict, the victims sustained multiple bodily injuries, which ultimately led to their deaths. According
To be fair, homeless people face violence not only in Ukraine. For example, in Spain, there was a case where a well-known blogger was sentenced to 15 months in prison and fined 20,000 euros for abusing a homeless person. He posted a video online where he walked through the city and offered a stranger who lived on the street some cookies that had been smeared with toothpaste beforehand. Later, it turned out that the cookie video was not the only evidence of abuse. Why do perpetrators choose homeless people as their victims? I guess it's because they look and often really are helpless, the kind of people nobody really cares about. That's the ideal target for wrongdoers. Unfortunately, the deputy head of the Oselia Mutual Aid Community Council, which takes care of the homeless, explained this attitude toward the homeless like this.
A homeless person often has low self-esteem and an inferiority complex, feeling no need to change anything. Sometimes they are not treated as people. Even the vocabulary that many use to refer to the homeless demonstrates this. People often say bums instead of homeless people. But what is a bum? Not a man or a woman. A neutral gender ambiguous term with a negative connotation.
But I won't moralize or explain what's good and what's bad. I think you, my viewers, understand everything yourselves well. That's the story for today. Thank you for watching the video until the very end. Please take care of yourselves, your family, and your loved ones. And I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.